In the wake of World War II, as the world grappled with the horrors of the Holocaust, one question haunted humanity more than any other. How could ordinary people participate in such extraordinary evil? The standard answer, that Nazi perpetrators were simply monsters, fundamentally different from the rest of us, offered the comfort of distance. But a young social psychologist named Stanley Milgram suspected this explanation was not just incomplete, but dangerously misleading. In 1961, as Adolf Eichmann faced trial for his Holocaust involvement, Milgram initiated a series of studies at Yale University that would transform our understanding of human conduct. His research examined a straightforward question: would typical Americans comply with an authority figure who directed them to cause pain to an innocent person? The outcomes astonished observers and continue to resonate today, compelling us to face uncomfortable realities about our own potential for compliance when directed by perceived authorities. Milgram himself summarized the disturbing implications. The most fundamental lesson of our study is that ordinary people, simply doing their jobs and without any particular hostility on their part, can become agents in a terrible destructive process. This insight, that harmful acts often stem not from malice but from compliance, challenges our most cherished beliefs about moral independence and individual conscience. Milgram's brilliance was in creating an experiment both elegantly straightforward and deeply revealing. Participants, recruited through newspaper ads offering payment for their time, thought they were joining a memory and learning study. Upon arriving at Yale's prestigious Lindsley Chittenden Hall, each participant encountered an authoritative researcher in a lab coat and another apparent participant who would serve as the learner. Through a predetermined setup, the actual participant always became the teacher. The teacher watched as the learner was secured to an electric chair in a neighboring room. The teacher was then positioned at an impressive shock generator with 30 switches, marked from 15 to 450 volts, with descriptive labels ranging from slight shock to danger, severe shock, and finally to simply XXX for the highest levels. The instructions seemed clear: read word pairs to the learner, test their recall and administer an electric shock for each incorrect answer, increasing the voltage with each mistake. The participant believed the learner received actual shocks, though none were administered. As voltage levels increased, the learner expressed discomfort, then distress, then agony. At 150 volts, the learner demanded release from the study. At 300 volts, they refused to continue and pounded on the wall in protest. After 330 volts, the learner went silent, suggesting unconsciousness, or worse. When participants hesitated or wanted to stop, the researcher prompted them with standardized phrases: "Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It's absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on." These carefully calibrated prompts, invoking authority without explicit threats, were crucial to understanding how compliance functions in real-world contexts, where direct coercion is rarely needed to elicit harmful behavior. What makes Milgram's design so powerful is how it isolates the variable of compliance to authority. Participants had no personal animosity toward the learner, and no independent motivation to harm them. The only force driving them to inflict pain was the researcher's instructions. This stripped-down scenario allowed Milgram to examine compliance in its purest form, free from ideological, personal, or material incentives that might complicate interpretation. Before conducting his studies, Milgram surveyed psychiatrists, college students, and middle-class adults, asking them to predict how far participants would go. The consensus was clear: only 1 to 2% would administer the maximum shock, with most refusing once the learner began protesting. The actual results defied these predictions dramatically. In the baseline condition, 65% of participants continued to the maximum 450-volt level, even after the learner fell silent. These participants continued following instructions to completion. This stark contrast between prediction and reality highlights how poorly we understand our own susceptibility to authority and how strongly we cling to comforting myths about our moral strength. Even more troubling than this figure was participants' visible distress during the process. Many trembled, sweated, stuttered, bit their lips, dug fingernails into their flesh, and laughed nervously. Some experienced seizures. One participant, describing his emotional state, said, "I was a wreck. I was a wreck. I was shaking. I was sweating. I was stuttering. I was reacting in a way I've never reacted before, ever." Yet despite the psychological turmoil, most continued to comply. To ensure these findings weren't anomalous, Milgram conducted 18 variations, altering key variables to identify factors affecting compliance. When the researcher was physically distant and was giving instructions by phone, compliance dropped to 21%. When participants witnessed others refusing, compliance plummeted to 10%. When free to choose the shock level, virtually none administered severe shocks. Perhaps most telling, when the experimenter directed participants to administer high-level shocks, but then left the decision in participants' hands rather than commanding it, compliance dropped from 62.5% to 20.5%. This revealed that many participants knew the moral course of action, but needed permission from authority to follow their conscience, a phenomenon that helps explain how systems of harm persist, despite individual misgivings. Milgram also found no significant differences in compliance rates based on gender, age, education level, or personality traits. This universality underscored his central theme: the capacity for authority-driven harmful behavior isn't limited to a sadistic few, but exists as a potential in ordinary people across demographic boundaries. This democratization of potential wrongdoing, the recognition that it's not just bad people who do bad things, remains one of Milgram's most unsettling and important insights. What psychological mechanisms allow seemingly decent people to inflict suffering when directed? Milgram identified several key factors facilitating this transformation. First is the agentic state, a condition where people view themselves not as autonomous individuals, but as instruments implementing another's will. In this state, individuals focus on performing their assigned role, rather than considering the consequences. This shift enables a corresponding transfer of responsibility. Participants who administered maximum shocks consistently attributed responsibility to the researcher, using phrases like, "I was just following instructions," or "It wasn't my place to question the experiment." This abdication of moral agency, what Milgram called the agentic shift, allows people to engage in actions that would normally violate their ethical standards. Complementing this is what sociologist Zygmunt Bauman called the social production of distance: physical, emotional, and mechanical separation from consequences makes harmful behavior easier to sustain. In Milgram's experiment, walls separated teacher from learner, the shock machine created technological mediation, and the researcher's presence provided social buffering. As distance increases, moral restraint decreases, a principle that helps explain how modern bureaucracies, technologies, and organizational structures can facilitate systemic harm despite being staffed by individually decent people. A third crucial factor is the incremental progression into harmful behavior. Participants began with mild 15 volts shocks and increased gradually. Each small step made the next seem like a natural progression rather than crossing a moral. This foot-in-the-door phenomenon explains how ordinary individuals can be led incrementally toward extraordinary harm. As Milgram noted, there is a tendency, once having acted in a certain way, to justify that action. Once one has administered a smaller shock X, it becomes easier to administer a bigger shock X plus 1. This insight helps explain how people become entangled in escalating patterns of harmful behavior in organizations, relationships, and political movements. The power of situational pressures also manifested in what Milgram called binding factors, psychological, social, and situational forces that made extraction from the experiment increasingly difficult. Once participants had administered several shocks, refusing to continue would require them to confront the implications of their earlier behavior. Continued compliance allowed them to maintain cognitive consistency and avoid acknowledging their complicity in harm, a pattern observed in numerous real-world scenarios of collective wrongdoing. The legitimacy of the context, Yale University, scientific research, the researcher's professional demeanor, cloaked the proceedings in an aura of normalcy and purpose. As political philosopher Hannah Arendt observed in her analysis of Nazi bureaucrat Adolf Eichmann, wrongdoing often presents itself not as malevolence but as duty, not as transgression but as compliance with established protocols. This normalization of harm through institutional legitimacy remains one of the most powerful mechanisms by which unethical behavior becomes acceptable in otherwise ethical organizations. Any discussion of Milgram's experiments must address the ethical controversy they sparked. The studies became central in arguments for stronger research ethics protections, directly influencing informed consent requirements and institutional review boards that now govern psychological research worldwide. Critics raised several compelling objections. First was the issue of deception. Participants were systematically misled about the study's purpose and the reality of the shocks. This deception, critics argued, violated participants' autonomy and right to informed choice about participation in activities that might challenge their self-conception or cause distress. Second was the question of psychological harm. Many participants experienced extreme distress, with some showing traumatic stress responses. One observer recalled, "I saw a mature and initially poised businessman enter the laboratory smiling and confident. Within 20 minutes, he was reduced to a twitching, stuttering wreck who was rapidly approaching nervous collapse." Critics questioned whether the knowledge gained justified this level of distress. Third was the matter of damaged self-knowledge. Revealing to participants their capacity for compliance under authority forced them to confront a disturbing aspect of themselves they might have preferred not to know. As philosopher Immanuel Kant argued, there are some truths about human nature perhaps better left unexplored if they undermine our necessary self-respect. Milgram defended his work on several grounds. He conducted post-experimental debriefings to explain the deception and reassure participants they hadn't actually harmed anyone. Follow-up surveys indicated 84% of participants were glad to have participated, and 74% said they learned something important about themselves. Milgram also argued that the knowledge gained, particularly its relevance to preventing atrocities, justified the temporary discomfort experienced by participants. Beyond ethical concerns, methodological critiques have emerged. Some researchers question whether participants truly believed they were administering real shocks, suggesting demand characteristics might have informed participants it was a simulation. Others argue that Milgram's focus on compliance obscured other factors, like engaged followership, the possibility that participants continued not just from compliance but from identification with the experiment's scientific goals. These critiques, while important, haven't fundamentally undermined Milgram's central finding about our susceptibility to authority. While Milgram's experiments occurred in a laboratory, their implications extend far beyond. The Nazi extermination system relied not just on ideological extremists, but on thousands of ordinary citizens, train conductors, clerks, police officers, doctors, performing specialized roles within a bureaucratic structure. As historian Christopher Browning demonstrated in his study of Reserve Police Battalion 101, Average people with no prior history of violence can become killers when embedded in authority structures that normalize and distribute responsibility for atrocity. More recent examples abound. The My Lai massacre during the Vietnam War exemplified how military authority and dehumanization can override individual moral restraint. Lieutenant William Calley, who ordered his men to execute villagers, later explained, "I was ordered to go in there and destroy the enemy. That was my job that day." This explanation parallels the justifications offered by Milgram's participants almost exactly. The Abu Ghraib prison scandal revealed American soldiers mistreating Iraqi prisoners while following directives from intelligence officers seeking information. The soldiers' defense that they were following orders and protocols echoed the justifications of Milgram's participants decades earlier. This continuity across time and context suggests the mechanisms Milgram identified aren't historically or culturally specific, but reflect enduring features of human psychology and hierarchical situations. Corporate scandals like the Ford Pinto case, where executives knowingly sold unsafe vehicles, and the Volkswagen emissions fraud demonstrate how organizational pressure can lead employees to participate in harmful practices despite personal misgivings. These examples highlight how Milgram's findings apply not just to extreme scenarios of violence, but to everyday ethical compromises in professional settings. These real-world parallels highlight a disturbing truth: the psychological mechanisms Milgram identified operate continuously in our societies, organizations, and institutions. As psychologist Philip Zimbardo observed, evil consists in intentionally behaving in ways that harm, abuse, demean, dehumanize, or destroy innocent others, or using one's authority and systemic power to encourage or permit others to do so on your behalf. This broader application of Milgram's insights helps explain patterns of institutional wrongdoing across domains from healthcare to finance to government. If Milgram's findings reveal our vulnerability to authority, they also contain seeds of hope. The significant minority who resisted demonstrate that destructive compliance is not inevitable. By studying these disobedient heroes, we can identify strategies for strengthening moral courage in the face of harmful directives. What distinguished those who refused? First was their willingness to question authority. Defiant participants often requested clarification about responsibility, asking variations of, "Who is responsible if something happens to the learner?" This critical questioning created psychological space between the researchers' demands and their own actions. Second was their empathic connection with the victim. Those who refused mentioned concern for the learner's welfare, making statements like, "I can't continue, I don't care about your experiment." This empathic identification counteracted the distancing mechanisms that facilitate harm. When we truly see others' humanity and suffering, our capacity for harmful compliance diminishes. Third was their recognition of choice and agency. Disobedient participants rejected claims they had no choice by asserting their moral autonomy with statements like, "I do have a choice, I'm not going to continue this." Reclaiming of personal agency, the refusal to surrender moral responsibility to an authority figure, appears crucial for resistance. Fourth was their willingness to accept the discomfort of nonconformity. Standing against authority creates anxiety, embarrassment, and fear of judgment. Those who resisted accepted these uncomfortable feelings rather than escaping them through compliance. This tolerance for psychological discomfort may be a key component of moral courage worth cultivating. Fifth was their recourse to higher principles, invoking moral or ethical frameworks that transcended the researcher's authority. By appealing to values that outranked the immediate authority structure, these participants effectively neutralized the experimenter's power to determine their actions. Psychology professor Ervin Staub, who studies genocide prevention, suggests several practical approaches for cultivating resistance to destructive compliance, developing critical thinking skills, practicing empathy for those unlike ourselves, fostering moral courage through small acts of standing up for principle, creating support systems for dissenters, and promoting inclusive values that recognize all humans as deserving of care. Modern versions of Milgram's paradigm have confirmed his core findings. In 2009, psychologist Jerry Berger replicated the experiment with additional safeguards, finding compliance rates comparable to Milgram's. In 2015, researchers created a virtual reality version, finding participants displayed stress and discomfort similar to Milgram's subjects. In 2017, a documentary team recreated the experiment for BBC television, again finding high rates of compliance. These modern confirmations suggest Milgram's findings weren't anomalies of a particular historical moment, but reflect enduring aspects of human psychology. As psychologist Thomas Blass concludes, the replicability of Milgram's findings over time and across cultures is consistent with the idea that the capacity for destructive obedience represents a robust feature of human nature. This consistency makes the study of resistance strategies all the more important. The contemporary relevance extends beyond extreme scenarios. In an era of increasing authoritarianism worldwide, understanding the psychological foundations of compliance becomes crucial for preserving democratic values. As political scientist Karen Stenner has demonstrated, approximately one-third of populations across cultures display authoritarian predispositions, tendencies to prefer strong leadership and conformity over pluralism and individual autonomy. Digital technologies create new vectors for authority and influence. Social media algorithms, nudge technologies, and surveillance systems leverage subtle forms of authority to direct behavior, often below conscious awareness. As technology ethicist Tristan Harris argues, we're all vulnerable to social persuasion because we're human beings with human vulnerabilities. We're all susceptible to being steered by technology. Understanding Milgram's insights helps us recognize and resist these modern forms of influence. Climate scientist James Hansen suggests that organizational compliance contributes to our collective failure to address global challenges. The problem is not that people working in corporations are bad. It's that they're working within a system where they feel they must meet quarterly profit expectations. They're responding to the immediate authority rather than the greater good. This insight suggests that addressing major societal problems may require redesigning institutional authority structures to align individual incentives with collective welfare. Perhaps most relevant to everyday life is how Milgram's insights apply to organizational context. Workplace hierarchies, corporate culture, and professional norms all constitute authority structures that can override individual ethical judgment. From financial fraud to product safety issues to workplace harassment, organizational wrongdoing often persists because employees prioritize compliance with supervisors over ethical principles or even legal requirements. The Milgram experiments reveal a fundamental tension in human nature. We are simultaneously moral beings, capable of compassion, yet deeply susceptible to authority structures that can redirect these capacities toward harmful ends. This paradox challenges our cherished notions of moral autonomy and individual responsibility. Philosopher Zygmunt Bauman captures this tension. It is difficult to harm a person we touch. It is somewhat easier to afflict a person we only see at a distance. It is still easier in the case of a person we only hear. It is quite easy to cause suffering to a person we neither see nor hear. Milgram's genius was in systematically demonstrating how authority exploits these human tendencies to distance and compartmentalize. Yet his findings need not lead to despair.
By illuminating the processes enabling destructive compliance, Milgram also illuminated paths of resistance. As he emphasized, it may be that we are puppets controlled by the strings of society, but at least we are puppets with perception, with awareness, and perhaps our awareness is the first step to our liberation. This awareness takes several forms. We can recognize situations structured to facilitate harmful compliance. We can identify the psychological mechanisms that enable our participation. We can cultivate habits of critical questioning, empathic connection, and recourse to higher principles that strengthen our resistance to harmful directives. Most importantly, we can create social structures that distribute rather than concentrate authority, that encourage rather than punish dissent, and that prioritize ethical reasoning over blind compliance. As political theorist Hannah Arendt argued, the sad truth is that most evil is done by people who never make up their minds to be good or evil. By designing systems that help people make up their minds to prioritize ethical considerations, we can reduce the likelihood of destructive compliance. In the end, Milgram's work offers both a warning and hope. The warning is that our capacity for moral autonomy is more fragile than we believe, vulnerable to authority structures that can redirect our actions toward harm. The hope is that by understanding this vulnerability, we can strengthen our resistance and cultivate the courage to refuse when conscience demands it. As Martin Luther King Jr. reminded us, the time is always right to do what is right. Milgram showed us why this simple moral truth is so difficult to follow in practice, and in doing so, gave us tools to make it more possible. By understanding the forces that shape our compliance, we take the first step toward true moral freedom.